technique that resolves phantom limb pain and a treatment undergoing a major research project at Oklahoma State University that returns the elderly to walking without canes and walkers many times in one treatment. So he's an expert on a lot of different things. Nitric oxide is one of them, and he's going to share that with us now. So Dr. Hayes, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Duke. Happy to be here. I love to share nitric oxide and what it does for people. It's truly amazing. But I'm going to have the same issue that Dr. Secret had, which is getting this to, I'm not sure how to make this work. Okay, so let's talk about nitric oxide is absolutely a miracle molecule, which is really the name of this talk. And it won the Nobel Prize back in 1998. 3 different scientists from 3 different areas of the country. You had Robert Furchgott, who was out in New York, Louis Ignarro, who was in Los Angeles, and Farad Murad, who was in Houston, Texas, all came up with the answer at the same time. We were looking for what in the world is it that's causing blood vessels to open up, and how does that work, and so forth, and nobody knew how it was done. And they all came up with it at the same time, and they got the Nobel Prize in 1998. In fact, that was so important. Can you, next slide, please? Sorry about that. That the New York Times had this headline: "The discovery of nitric oxide and its function is one of the most important in the history of cardiovascular medicine." That's from Dr. Valentin Fuster, who at the time was the president of the American Heart Association. Very, very important. Next slide. Now, you actually have another doctor that is out in California. He was a practicing, goodness gracious, he worked with diabetes. he was awesome, and he took nitric oxide, just a nitric oxide formulation that he put together. He was right across the street from Stanford University there in Palo Alto. He had 8,000 patients that were treated in 19 years, from 1991 to 2010. 8,000 patients, he had no heart attacks, no amputations, no strokes, and no stents. That's important. He was named the American Diabetic Association Father of the Year. I've had the opportunity to lecture with Dr. Pendergrass a few times, Dr. Joseph Pendergrass, and what an amazing finding, simply by using nitric oxide. Now, can you imagine if you take nitric oxide and you add that with Avicin? My goodness, you would really have an amazing situation. Next slide. So what is your risk of heart disease? Well, let's take a look at that. Next slide. This came from the Wall Street Journal, June 1st, 2010. And I use it because they did such a good job of making it simple for everybody. A man is as old as his arteries. That's an English physician back in 1624 to 1689, Thomas Sydenham. Next slide. So what happens, we know that from the 20s all the way up to 60 plus, back in the 20s, we have real nice, beautiful, wide open arteries. And then we get to the 30s, we still have some really nice arteries, but you'll see a change that's occurring in the lower part of the left-hand side there. You see that thickening that's developing. And so we start to see that in our 30s. In the 40s, you start to see a change to that vessel, and it increases over time. When we get to the 60s, there's been some major changes. So we're going to take even a better look at that. Next slide. So here are the complications. Next slide. So this is a normal blood vessel. So what you're looking at in front of you, if we start at the very top of the vessel, you've got muscle. Then you have a fat layer. Then you have what's called the endothelial system. That one cell that you see there in a line, you've got on this you see 5 of them. And then you've got the blood vessel itself. Then you go back down again and you see the endothelial system again, because it's round. And then you've got fat, and then you've got muscle. That's what the blood vessel should look like. And when it's in that state, there you're about age 20, everything's wonderful. It works great. Next slide. But then we start getting into our 30s, and we start having this start to bubble up and develop, where we start to have changes that are occurring with that blood vessel, most people think that it's the triglycerides and so forth on the inside of that blood vessel. That's not it at all. It's actually from outside the blood vessel that you start to have the closing of that blood vessel. Next slide. So that progresses along a little bit further. Next slide. And then suddenly it ruptures. And when it ruptures, your body has to try to deal with it. And that's what shows up on the inside of that vessel. Next slide. And you have a blood clot that forms like this. And then you see it over time mass like that. And now the blood can't get through there and you have a heart attack because the blood can't get to where it needs to go to. That's a serious complication. And it's what kills the majority of people in the world is this type of thing. So that's what you want to clear out. And I've got some news for you today about what nitric oxide actually does. And I'll share that with you in just a couple moments. Next slide. So what is nitric oxide? It's now recognized as one of the most important molecules produced in our body. Next, click. It's a signaling molecule. Now, what does a signaling molecule mean? It helps cells communicate with one another. It means they can basically talk to one another. And a way of indicating this to you is if my toe isn't getting enough circulation, it can communicate and a blood vessel can open up and it can get that blood down there, as long as you've got the ability of it to get down there. It's a primary signaling function that in the vasculature, it is the one that's responsible for the signaling. Nitric oxide is the master of homeostasis, which means keeping everything working properly and working normally. As it regulates blood flow to the cells, it ensures nutrient and oxygen delivery to all the different cells of the body. It's produced by that endothelium tissue, which again, that's one cell wide. That's all. So you've got the blood cell. It's the one outer cell of that blood cell that is the endothelial tissue. The Nobel Prize was given in 1998 for its discovery for its effect on the cardiovascular system. Next slide. So you have something that occurs, and here's what it is. You've got the blood vessel in this case. You have something called shear stress, which means stress coming in opposite directions. It affects the nitric oxide synthase, which is an enzyme. The L-arginine and L-citrulline is affected, the L-arginine mostly, and then that produces nitric oxide. The nitric oxide goes out of the endothelial system. Next slide. Back up one slide. We're missing one. Try one more time. I don't know what happened to that slide. There was a go back again to that one. I'll go over it. All right. So there it goes down further into the next step that you're not seeing here is a reaction takes place that goes down further into the muscle. ATP is produced. The ATP relaxes that muscle and it lets the blood vessel open up. That's how it works. Next slide. Now here's something very interesting, and you saw this to some degree. You saw this when our first speaker was talking about blood vessels. You saw how it showed a narrow artery and it showed a wider artery. This is an actual intervital microscopy. In other words, you're actually seeing a true blood vessel. And if you saw this in the way that I use it in my lectures, I actually have it showing blood going through it. What you see is those little white markers along the bottom of the vessel. What those are they're cells in the blood. So you saw those blood cells going through. These are macrophages and there are things like that that are crawling along that blood vessel. And when you see it in this narrowed state, and by the way, this is after a 6-week bad diet, is what this is showing us. It narrows, and it's pretty narrow. Next slide. The next slide, this is the same area of the artery, and you see how much wider it is? That's because of nitric oxide. It widens that artery and it allows things to go through. And then if you saw the actual footage itself, you'd actually see all those cells just flying through there like they're designed to fly through there. That happens with nitric oxide. Next slide. So this is an artist rendition, and again, this is a movie, but unfortunately, I didn't have the file was too big to send by email, so I could just send it this way. So what you have is you have the blood cells going through the artery. The pink is the endothelial system, and the smooth muscles are outside. And what happens is all that nitric oxide is pumped out of that endothelial system and to the side into the muscles, and it relaxes the muscle and it opens up that blood vessel, and all of that can go through faster. Now, undoubtedly, you have to have some of that happen just with the Avicen alone. But what happens with nitric oxide is if you can get the nitric oxide functioning again in your body, then it'll continue to function that way, and you'll always have it functioning. Next slide. So what you're seeing here is, how does nitric oxide affect our body? It's all over the place. We're talking about here on the left side, the cardiovascular side, blood cell regulation, myocardial contractility, microvascular permeability, all those types of things, reduction of triglycerides, C-reactive protein regulation. Then we go over to the peripheral nervous system. It's involved in that. It's involved in the central nervous system. It's involved in the stomach. It helps with motility in the stomach. Cell proliferation, the cells being produced, the cells dying, stem cell activity, respiratory tract. There's amazing things you can do with the respiration with nitric oxide. The immune system is affected. It affects it very positively. And sexual health. Yes, that's true. Sexual health is involved with this because the reason that you have male performance and female arousal issues is because of the inability to produce blood into that area. So erectile dysfunction is the loss of that blood. And the body can't produce it, so it can't get it through the vessels for things to work properly. So it's involved in all these different areas. Next slide. So low nitric oxide really does have predictive power. Experimental and clinical studies provide evidence that endothelial dysfunction is not only associated with all major cardiovascular risk factors, including hyperlipidemia, diabetes, hypertension, smoking, and severity of atherosclerosis. It also has a profound predictive value for future atherosclerotic disease progression. So if we have low nitric oxide, we can actually predict that you're going to have problems with your cardiovascular system because this is what's going on inside your body because you don't have the nitric oxide. Next slide. So what are the consequences of the nitric oxide insufficiency? Well, hypertension or high blood pressure is one of the first things we see. The atherosclerosis is forming, and that forms over a period of time. Thrombosis, which is blood clotting, Alzheimer's, sexual dysfunction, ED, for example, chronic kidney disease, peripheral artery disease, immune dysfunction, gastrointestinal dysfunction. All of those are involved, and all of those are consequences of having nitric oxide insufficiency. Type 2 diabetes is a big one. That's where Dr. Pendergrass had such success, was with his type 2 diabetic patients. Most people that have diabetes, they're going to end up dying, not as directly from the diabetes directly, but indirectly with cardiovascular events and things of that nature. And he didn't have any of those things. That was just an amazing situation to happen. And it was totally because he used a nitric oxide product. And cancer you can have as a result of this because you have uncontrolled cell proliferation that occurs. Next slide. Heart disease is the leading cause of death for men and women, both in the United States and worldwide. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it's all over the world. More than half of all people who die are men. These statistics are actually current as of July 4th of 2019. That's when these latest statistics came out. There's a lot of people out there that have the problem. Now, here's the bottom line. Here's where our problem is and why we don't have the nitric oxide. Because the production of nitric oxide declines with age. So this is a study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And you have 100% nitric oxide production when you're 10 and when you're 20. But for men at age 20, you start to lose that ability. It starts to go down. And as it goes down, you can see by the time that you're age 60 that you're down at about 15% of your nitric oxide production. Women, you have a slower curve, but you also get there too. You don't have enough nitric oxide in your body to maintain what you're supposed to. So by age 40, men produce about 50% of the nitric oxide that they produced when they were younger. By age 50, women produce about 50%. Next slide. Now, here's some exciting news. we now understand that there's two ways to get nitric oxide in the body, not just one. You've got the L-arginine pathway, which we get primarily from our diet. That's where that one comes from. It's nitric oxide synthase dependent. That means that you have to have the enzyme being able to do its job so that it can go through that reaction that I showed you. And you've got the other side, which is not nitric oxide synthase dependent. It's actually independent of nitric oxide synthase. And that was an exciting finding, because when we came out originally with the Nobel Prize, everybody thought it was all the L-arginine pathway. That's not true. There's actually two, and there's possibly a third one, but they don't understand the third one well enough. But it's the second one is the nitrate-nitrite pathway. In other words, your body takes in a nitrate. You take your bacteria that's on your tongue will convert it into nitrite. The nitrite drops into your stomach, and then it can convert to nitric oxide. So production of nitric oxide is shared by these two complementary pathways. We need both of the pathways for optimal levels of nitric oxide. Defects in one or the other can cause a nitric oxide deficiency state. So the goal is to restore function in both pathways. Nitric oxide is needed for immediate rescue and to facilitate change. Nitric oxide is very important. Next slide. So there is a way you can measure it. You can measure it through what are called nitric oxide indicator strips. And what you do is you simply take one of these strips, you put it on your tongue, and it comes up with a color. You're either depleted, or you can go all the way to that nice pinkish color, which means that you're normal. Very simple to test it. And when you're normal, when you consistently come back up normal, that means that you're producing nitric oxide as you should. Next slide. Now, you take diabetes. It's nothing more than a perpetual system. You have decreased nitric oxide, which turns into diabetes, which turns into more decreased nitric oxide, and it's just a never-ending cycle. And finally, you die from those problems. And it's a serious situation, and it's the #1 killer in the world. And actually, those things can be solved. Next slide. So should we be concerned about our nitric oxide status? Yes, you should be concerned about your nitric oxide status. How do we correct nitric oxide insufficiency? Well, next slide. You start with your diet. So you have nitric oxide and antioxidant capacity of common beverages. As you can see, pomegranate is excellent. You've got polyphenol, you've got nitrate in it, you've got nitrite, and various things that you actually eat and that you actually drink can affect dramatically what your outcome is like. Next slide. Okay, we're missing a slide there, and I want to cover what that slide is. So give me a second here. So when we eat the typical Western diet that we eat, which is actually a pretty pitiful diet. Let's say you take, I'm going to give you a basic Western diet. Breakfast might be bagel with cream cheese and black coffee. An AM snack might be a carrot nut muffin, Diet Coke. A lunch, Big Mac, large fries, Diet Coke. PM snack might be Snickers, black coffee. And dinner, cheese pizza, 4 slices, Diet Coke. That will give you about 30% of the nitric oxide magnesium. That's it. Now, if you go to a Mediterranean menu, toast of jam and butter, cappuccino express with milk. AM snack would be yogurt, strawberry, carrot juice. Lunch would be Mediterranean wrap, garden vegetable soup, mineral water. PM snack might be trail mix, orange juice, and then dinner salmon, smoked, and red wine. There you get 350 milligrams of nitric oxide. You went from 30 milligrams to 350 milligrams just based on your diet. That's how important it is. So let's talk about some patient responses. I've used nitric oxide in my practice for a long time. This happens to be my daughter-in-law. She had some blood pressure problems. The initial blood pressure on 8/5/2015 was 178 over 110. That's a serious situation. If you maintain that blood pressure for a while, you are going to have a heart attack. On 12/3/15, she had a blood pressure of 131 over 78. Still not normal, but she was getting it down. Blood pressure on 10/20/17, 120 over 79, blood pressure at 4/26/18, 121 over 74. In other words, this came down and has stayed down as a result of her being on nitric oxide. That was the key there. Now you add Avicen to that and you actually improve that even more. Next slide. Oh, now I have to talk about myself. That's terrible. Initial blood pressure 220 over 118 on 7/14/2015. And I brought it down over a period of time, no medication at all, just with nitric oxide to 116 over 70 as of 4/24/18. And I took it this morning and I'm 118 over 68. So I'm living proof myself because I use it. All right. Arginine analogs, and nitric oxide production in the chronic kidney disease. Now, this is a patient, you'll see his picture in just a moment, or this is a lady. She had nitric oxide is directly involved in how your kidneys work. And there's evidence that nitric oxide deficiency contributes to cardiovascular events and serious progression of kidney damage. Next slide. Next slide. There she is. Sherry Torner. What happened to Sherry, she had a spinal infection from a tick bite in 2012. She was given this 3-drug cocktail that is known for crashing kidneys. She went down to about 15% function until April of 2015, when she went below 10% and had to go on dialysis. Now, she was having some time when she would exceed the fluid that would typically be taken off. Her mouth was very, very dry. She felt like she had to pry her tongue from her cheek, is what she said. And normally when I show this, she's actually telling these things herself in the picture. But she was on kidney dialysis. And one of the things that you have when you have when you're on kidney dialysis, most people cannot pee at all. You don't have the ability to do that any longer. And as soon as I reestablished nitric oxide for her, she began peeing within about a week. And it was dramatic what happened and how it improved her dramatically. Next slide. Now, you also have nitric oxide and ADMA, which is asymmetric dimethylarginine. I don't want to get into the details of all that stuff, but while circulating ADMA is higher, nitric oxide is lower in COPD patients. So in COPD, we know, and lung problems, we know that if you do not have nitric oxide that's functioning well, you're going to have a major problem with it. Next slide. So this is Jack Hopkins. He was a smoker for many years. He had to be on oxygen 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. Next slide. And we're missing his picture, but I'll just finish telling you about Jack. So with Jack, he was a medical photographer. As I said earlier, he smoked a lot. In fact, he was a chain smoker. It was terrible. And he quit 22 years ago. And yet he has COPD, oxygen all the time. He came in one day to me and for another problem, and he could hardly breathe. And here he's got an oxygen, and he can hardly breathe at all. It was rattling. It was terrible. And I put him on nitric oxide right then and there, and within 15 minutes, he went down in terms of having that response. I got him so that he could be off of oxygen for as much as 4 hours a day, which is pretty interesting. And that was within a period of about 5 to 6 weeks. Next slide. Now, at that time, I didn't have Avicen. Avicen would be awesome for him because it'll probably take him off longer than that. So Raynaud's phenomena. Raynaud's phenomena is a situation where you go out and you get into cold, and all of a sudden you can't feel the ends of your fingers. It hurts a lot. There's very little blood flow into your hands, and you can actually do dramatic things with the Raynaud's phenomena, and you can do that with Avicen also. Next slide. Well, what you were going to see is you were going to see the person who Just a minute, I've got it right here. There, Eric Forney, he was a former world-class pole vaulter, and now he likes to climb mountains. I've never understood why he liked to climb mountains, but he loves climbing right up rock cliffs and things of that nature. But the problem is, he would literally have to go out to climb a rock or climb a cliff or whatever he's climbing, and he would have to heat his hands up in water. Literally, he'd take a little camp stove with him, he'd bring it out there, he'd heat it up, put his hands in the water, warm them up so he could make that climb. If he's up on the cliff, he had to have that with him if he's staying overnight as he's going up some real high mountain. And put him on nitric oxide, dramatically changed his life. All he needs to do is take the nitric oxide and he can climb without, he doesn't even take the camp stove with him anymore. I mean, that's something, just an automatic thing that you can solve that problem. And yet what you're seeing here is a nature review, what they think causes it and so forth. And it isn't even close to what my experience is. Next slide. I think actually the next slide was the questions. If there's anybody that has any questions.
Hey, Dr. Hayes, this is Duke. I'm back on. Because it is a chat, it's a little bit difficult to get some of those questions on. So what I'm going to do is just